and welcome to Talking F1. We are a podcast that does pretty much that. We talk about F1. More specifically, though, we talk about Formula 1, Formula 2, Formula 3, and the W Series. And this week, we are going to talk F1 about the Bahrain Grand Prix. I'm your host, Jim Kimberley, and joining me are my co-hosts. We've got Gareth Winslade. How are you, Gareth?
Hello, very well, thank you, Jim. And yourself?
Yes, I'm doing very, very well. And also I've got Thiemo Albers-Daly. How are you, Thiemo?
I'm great, thank you. How are you?
Yes, very good. Very excited because the racing is back. We were in Bahrain and we had 4 races in total with 2 sprint races in Formula 2, 1 feature race of Formula 2 and Formula 1. And I think the sprint race of Formula 2 was okay, the first one, but all the other 3, absolute barnstormers. So, there's so much to go through. I think we should start on Formula 2 first. Gareth, talk us through your thoughts overall about Formula 2. We've got a bunch of rookies coming up. They seem to do well, 2 of them taking wins. And we saw Guanyu Zhou taking his first feature race win. I think that's correct. And then, Christian Lundgaard, really impressive. Just everything. Yeah, you're the longest GP2 and Formula 2 fan here. How was it from your perspective?
Yeah, great weekend overall. Some fantastic racing across all 3 races. It's, like you say, I thought the first sprint race was a little slow compared to some F2 GP2 action that we've seen in the past. But if you compared that to your average F1 race, it was probably still one of the more exciting races. So there were still some fantastic battles. Liam Lawson taking the first win of the year, and as you say, as a rookie as well, so that was fantastic. Very impressed by Oscar Piastri as well. I thought he was amazing across the weekend. And Guanyu Zhou, I thought he just elevated himself to another level compared to the last 2 seasons. Whether that is due to you and I, Virtuosi, taking a step forward, obviously Drugovich was very fast as well, or whether it just down to Joe himself. I think it probably is Joe, actually. So, yeah, very
I think he heard you last week talking about how he was going to make or break from this year, and he thought, you know what, I'm going to just show that Gareth person what I've really got in here. So I'm going to get pole position straight away.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, he got the first pole of last year as well, but his driving across the whole 3 races was very impressive. And he made sure he maximised his opportunities, really. He could have had sprint race 2 as well as a victory if his tyres had just lasted that 1 lap more. So, yeah, very impressive drive.
Yeah, do you think, Thiemo, he's come off F3 Asia as a victory, and it's a bit of a step down, or a lot of a step down, depending on how you want to look at it from Formula 2. But he's come off that as his first championship in cars. Do you think that's just a confidence boost, or like Gareth suggests, do you think Virtuosi are one of the lead teams, if not the lead team for Formula 2 in 2021?
I think it's definitely a confidence boost. I mean, his F2 season last year didn't go entirely the way he wanted. He had some good moments, but like Gareth was saying last week, it was nowhere near where it needed to be. And so even if F3 was a step down for him in terms of what he's able to do, the fact that he could go there and win and prove that he's still got it is just a good thing to get that momentum going before the season starts off. And then it clearly did something good for him, because he then gets the pole and his first feature race win on the same weekend. So even if Virtuosi are doing better as a team, it's never a guarantee that the driver is going to be able to do that as well. So I think it all just came together at the right time, and hopefully he can keep that momentum going now. If that's doable or not we'll find out. There's a big gap between races at the moment, so there's probably more of a challenge on that side of things. Whereas if it was a couple of weeks' time, you might find it less challenging, but we'll just have to wait and see, I think. That's a good start.
The gap between the races is huge. And I do wonder in terms of momentum about, like you say, Joe got the pole position, and then it wasn't exactly a lights to flag victory. He wasn't in first place for a lot of that race, of the feature race, but the confidence he would have had from F3 Asia and now this, I think there's an element, if the next race was in a couple of weeks or 3 weeks, like the Emilia Romagna Grand Prix will be, then you can bounce back off that. But also, he's going to be sitting there, with such a such a strong showing for the next race with 2 months to let that sit inside of him, and you compare it against Drugovic, his teammate, who was fast but unfortunate and comes away with a couple of points. I don't know if that's the sort of thing that's just going to be something that would play on your mind for a couple of months. And I know last year, Gareth, and I don't know if this is normal, but there was big gaps between the races. Was it just after Russia and then the final rounds in the Middle East? How did that impact on the championship then? We had Schumacher, Eilert, Tsunoda to an extent, Schwartzman. How did the drivers work that out between having such big gaps between their championship rounds?
Honestly, I don't think it affects them that much, because it is quite normal in F2 to have that long gap. They used to go to Singapore occasionally, but since they stopped going to Singapore, like you say, they go to Russia, and then there is just that huge gap till they get to Abu Dhabi. But it doesn't. It's part of F2 now. There is that long gap as a long tension building moment. I mean, it's not ideal, but it just seems to be the way it is. This season, though, it is going to be so stop-start, like you say. I think that could be harder, because it's just sort of every race weekend, and we're going to stop, and we don't get that flow like normally. You go through pretty much the whole European season, and F2's on the calendar, so it's going to be different.
The benefit of it is the fact that with the big gap, though, that regardless of what kind of weekend you have a big gap to just reset, collect yourself, and then just go back into okay, I can afford to have an off week of training if I'm not feeling 100% or whatever. But then come the race weekend, you've got 3 days, 4 days where you've just got to absolutely nail everything. And if you don't, then you've still got like another 2 months to prepare yourself as much as you can for the next one. And it might impact the championship further into the season we get, but you've got that more time to kind of prepare yourself. So it depends on the driver, I think. So.
Yeah, and the advantage, though, is definitely for the affiliated drivers, so your Piastri, your Zhou, your Schwartzman, etc., who will be attending F1 races in their reserve driver role, and they'll be giving simulator days. So they're still going to have a very busy schedule, whereas an unaffiliated driver like Drugovic is just going to have to be focusing on doing his own routine of karting and training to fill that time. So I could see it really working in favour of the Formula One academy drivers this year.
And all 3 drivers that won this weekend were academy drivers, of course. And we touched on Lawson and we touched on Piastri. I have to say, Piastri was hugely impressive for me. He took the fight to Schwartzman, who I think most of us put as a favourite, and he seemed to fade in this first round. And Piastri, meanwhile, he's going to be fighting for top dog status, and he's got that currently from one round. It might be a bit too early to say, but if he has that sort of showing at Monaco, which I think is the next round, that's a quarter of the championship run. That's pretty significant, and at some point they'll be wanting to throw some sort of backing to think, maybe Piastri is the one that we need to champion. But he looked extremely racy for an F3 driver. Lawson, not taking anything away from him, but seeing just how well Piastri seemed to handle himself in Formula 2, hugely impressive, Thiemo.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was probably slightly more pressure on him as he'd won the championship and he's going into a top team like Prema with Schwartzman as his teammate. And Schwartzman could have done with a weekend a bit like Zhou's in some respects, because he didn't have a great second half to the season last year after he was leading it for the championship for so long. So he could have really done with a much better weekend, and instead it's left him maybe questioning his status in the team as not necessarily number 1, number 2 driver, but there's a level difference there. And Piastri just didn't really put a foot wrong. He just kind of like, well, no one told me I couldn't do this, so I'm just going to go and do it and drive really, really well and just take a win while I'm at it. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see how that goes and how much that plays in the inter-team battles between the two of them, especially.
Yeah, some strong teams in there. That race 2, Gareth, that last lap, that was insane. I mean, the 3 drivers, well, I think several points across the weekend, the fight for the lead was between 3 drivers, and 3 drivers going abreast, or the 3 cars abreast going into that first corner. Awful camera work from Formula One cameras for that fight between Piastri, Lundgaard and Zhou on that final one. But wow, that was amazing. Lundgaard didn't take the podium, but then did get the second place. We'll talk about that in a second. But that racing was thrilling. That was properly fight for the lead, 3 drivers, podium places up for grabs. Lundgaard wanted to get ahead because of what wasn't a penalty as it was at the time, but it looked like it was a penalty. It was just fantastic, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was amazing racing. But this is, for me, this is why Formula 2 is my favourite category of motorsport. It just, that kind of racing on the final lap is what Formula 2 consistently delivers year in and year out. And this is why we're talking about it, because it is just amazing racing. And it was a brilliant battle to see, though. I think, like you say, Piastri has just exploded onto this championship, and Schwartzman, who, he didn't qualify very well last year. That is definitely a weaker point in his armory, and he was shown up this weekend by Piastri, and that is going to have concerned him, and probably Prema. And I imagine there's going to be a lot of work going on between now and Monaco to understand what the problems were and, what he can do to improve. I mean, let's not forget, he qualified 11th which was poor, but then he did go from 11th to 4th over the race, but he did most of those moves in the first lap or two to get to 5th place. So I think a lot of that was, due to the safety car and a bit of chaos and stuff, but that's still good driving from Schwartzman. But overall on the weekend, tagging, was it Ticktum he crashed into? He had those issues. The Nissani crash, yeah. So he had enough accidents and incidents for a whole season in one weekend, as did Ticktum, but I'm sure we'll talk about him shortly.
Yeah, indeed we will. We've got this format, and we could talk all day about how good some of the fighting was, but new race format, a lot of controversy, maybe it's a bit too strong, but there's a lot of discussion about it. And when we spoke to some of the drivers, they were all skeptical. Skepticism is probably the best word. Piastri certainly suggested that he was happy with it, but when he's doing as well as he was, it's no surprise. But when you've got, say, the likes of Drugovich, for an example, who struggled this weekend, he might now consider it being too impactful. How bad, because he was tagged in the first race, from what I remember. Had the damaged front wing, had to go into the pits, was about 40 seconds behind the lead. So that scuppers him for 2 races of the weekend. Hugely impactful. Meanwhile, Piastri's, skipping and jumping around because of how well he's doing. Do you think, from a fan's perspective, the 3 races across the weekend is beneficial? We're going to see it in Formula 3 as well, Thiemo. What were your reactions? What were your thoughts on going between this triple race situation without having the feature race on the Saturday?
I was curious to see how it was going to go, because initially just trying to figure out what the order of everything was, because you have qualifying and then you don't use qualifying as is you would normally have it for the first race, then so just trying to get the head around that initially. But once that was sorted, I quite enjoyed it. I mean, like I said, the first race was not the best one that there's been, but I think that's just partly down to it being the very first one of the season and everyone just getting to grips with the new season. But then the racing after that, it got really good, and the feature race on Sunday I quite enjoyed. I do agree with Gareth on the point you made last week about it. Maybe there's something being taken a gleam off it slightly because it's then on the same day as the F1 race. So I don't know if I'd want a sprint race on a Saturday with a feature race and another sprint race on a Sunday. I don't know how that would change things up, but overall I quite enjoyed it. And I think that with the drivers having mixed feelings about it, I think Piastri could have a reverse opinion on that if he was having a bad weekend. So I think it really depends on how well you're doing in any given race, because the drivers are going to be self-interested. As soon as it doesn't benefit them, they're not going to like it. But as soon as it goes their way again, they'll be like, "Oh yeah, we should have always done it this way, and there's no problem with it. Keep it as is."
Yeah. The thing for me that surprised me the most, and this may be because of my relative newness to the junior formula, is reverse grid for 2 races, which in theory sounds fairly unfair. But because of how close the running was in those top drivers, old drivers, or I say old, experienced Formula 2 drivers and the F3 rookies, you couldn't really tell from my perspective. It was so higgledy-piggledy by the end of the first lap, with some drivers taking 7 positions. Yes, if you were in pole position and you find yourself in 5th at the end of the first lap, you'll be a bit annoyed. But I thought, in actual fact, yeah, bring it on. The reverse grid wasn't as impactful as I thought it perhaps could be, apart from drivers like Drugovich taking his front wing off in the early rounds. So, Gareth, are you thinking the reverse grids? You're used to them with having one, but having two, good for racing?
Yeah, I mean, reverse grids are good for racing because they do, provide overtaking. If you're the fastest driver in the field and you're suddenly back in the midfield, you are going to work your way up the grid. But like you say, overall for the weekend, you are going to get heavily punished if you have that disaster in race one, such as Drugovich had. We didn't see what happened to his rear wing, front wing, or just all of a sudden he was in the pits having a new one, and we were told that he'd had an incident with it. It was such a shame though, because he did show tremendous speed all weekend. But the other issue with it is that if you finish 11th, you're still going to start 11th. So you never get the benefit. And it was the same in the old format where if you finish 9th in a feature race, you'd start 9th on the grid because it was only a top 8 reverse. So someone like Samaya, who, 3 races, no points again, but he did finish 10th, but he was then penalised back to 11th. So he missed out on that pole position, which could have transformed his weekend, and it could have, ultimately transformed. Think of how much of a boost in confidence getting some points would be for someone like Samaya, and then to not actually have that was a huge kick. So
is that down to the race format though, or is that down to the driver just not performing to the best they could? Because he wouldn't have, if he hadn't done certain driving, he wouldn't have got penalised, and he would have kept the 10th place then.
But that's the thing. I mean, you try and find what the reason was, and it's very hard to actually find what he was penalised for. I haven't been able to find it.
That we're talking about?
No. This is still Samaya. Because I find him fascinating, because he came in after a half season of frack or something, and then just suddenly was in F2 last year. He didn't have the best of ways into the category, and the argument is, should he actually be there? But if he is there, you want to see him do well.
Well, I do want to say my understanding with Drugovich, from what I saw on social media, I believe, is that his front wing hit the rear of Zhou on that first race. So I think he must have gone fairly square on, because Zhou didn't seem to struggle all that much. So unfortunate for Drugovich, but yeah, that's what can you do?
That's racing.
Yeah, that's racing. But that's the point of that reverse grid. It's meant to, that was a concern, wasn't it? That some drivers were going to be in the middle of the fight or middle of the pack, where they were going to be having possibilities for contact, and it came off, and poor for Felipe. But yeah, that's racing, Thiemo, exactly right. But I questioned the VIP's decision, and Gareth, I understand you weren't watching the races live this weekend, so I'll give you and anybody listening or watching, and Nigel, for the benefit of those who are listening and not watching, there is a Nigel Mansell just sneaking in next to Gareth. He's not alone. But for you guys, Vips was qualified in 6th, I think, from the sole qualification. And then he was disqualified because the under tray of his car was 1.5 mil outside of the regulations that were being allowed. So he was then disqualified. Then on the Saturday, High Tech were going to appeal the disqualification, which, if they were going to follow through with it, he would then be reinstated, but then face disqualification from the race. And I think possibly all 3 races, because surely if he was starting from a position he should not have started from, that's going to affect all 3 races across the weekend. So we're at this crazy situation where Vips was going to be starting from last, and then he was going to be starting from 6th or 4th, depending on the reverse grid, and then last again. And the driver in 11th was going to be starting in pole, and then wasn't going to be starting in pole. It was just bizarre. But that was only one element of all of the stewarding decisions this weekend, which just baffled me. And this goes across Formula 2 and Formula 1. So again, Gareth, if you weren't aware, we had no idea after qualifying on F2 if Zhou was actually going to be taking the pole position for the feature race, because about 5 or 6 of the cars were under investigation for crossing the finish line twice, or taking the checkered flag twice, because of this new regulation that they had to go into the second
Support paddock.
The support paddock, exactly. And
No, I had seen that. Yeah,
it was
the
just
support paddock is on the outside of turn 10. That's how you get in there. So it's you wouldn't cross the finish line again. But it's madness, like you say.
well, it was just the start of things. This was on the Friday, of course, and we've got a fantasy league, and if you're not joined, please go to gpgrandstand.com/fantasy. And we're trying to put the scores in so everybody can get scored. I'm like, I don't know where anybody's finished at the moment. Vips is either qualified well or is disqualified, which gives you a points penalty. Zhou could be in pole position, or he could have a penalty as well. It was just, I was at Belgium for the Formula One in 2008, and I saw Lewis Hamilton cross the line first, and then afterwards they penalised him, and this was a race where Massa finished 20 odd seconds behind, and Massa won the race, even though he was so far behind. So I've got personal skin in the game of this, how bad stewarding decisions after the fact can be. I understand it's unavoidable, but the stewards are just awful this weekend. And then you go into Formula One, which we'll talk about with the track limits. We've also got Formula 2 with Ticktum, Schwartzman and Lundgaard having pretty similar incidents, but having 5-second penalty, 10-second penalty, and a drive-through penalty. Inconsistencies all over the place, Thiemo. I'm not alone in thinking this was ridiculous, am I?
No, I thought that Lundgaard's penalty and then Schwartzman's drive-through was a bit too harsh for what it was, because for the most part, most of these seemed like racing incidents. So I thought if you're going to give Ticktum of all people a 5-second penalty, then surely you should give everyone else a 5-second penalty, because they're much less accident prone to doing it. And when you look at just Ticktum's performance over the weekend in terms of accidents, like, just give him the 10-second one. And if you're going to do, at least keep it blanket in uniform, or at least give a good reason why not, because there didn't seem to be an explanation of why Lundgaard deserves an extra 5 seconds on his thing, or why Schwartzman gets arguably the worst one of having a drive-through, because he was so much time with that. Okay, yes, he made contact, but everyone made contact in this one. So it just didn't seem fair in any way there. So it was entertaining, but not for the right reason.
No, and we saw in race 2, Lundgaard with that 10-second penalty. And this is another thing, that the poor guy goes up to the podium and got this great shot of him, which is stupidly memeable, of this face. And again, for the benefit of those listening, I'm pulling a confused little face that Lundgaard had when he was told, no, you're not on the podium, you didn't serve your time penalty. And he's thinking, well, I went in the pits and served it then. Gareth, this is bonkers.
It's terribly poor of the stewards to not know that a driver has been in the pits and served a 10-second penalty. I think that they were caught out because it was under the safety car, but that's legal. They should know that. And there isn't really any excuse for them not knowing that and for stopping him going up. I mean, we've seen drivers go up to the podium in F1 before and then find out that the podium isn't theirs due to a penalty. I remember Verstappen and Kimi waiting there while he was ushered away so that Kimi could take the place on the podium.
Max in Mexico was hilarious.
Yeah. So those sort of things have happened, many times, but for a good reason, for a penalty that had to be applied, but not for a penalty that wasn't, was cleared. So that's a very poor stewarding management decision, in my opinion. Yeah.
I was going to say, if you look at it from a fan perspective, you could understand a bit of the confusion with regards to Lundgaard, because you saw that he received the penalty, but then with the coverage, you didn't see him serve it, as far as I'm aware. So then from his driving, it certainly seemed like he'd been told, because he was racing so much harder, and to get that second place. And from the way it was perceived, I thought they were going to be adding the 10 seconds on to the end, which is why he was driving so quickly. So I didn't think that second place was his when he drove over the finishing line. So then I was kind of surprised when they told him that they hadn't already mentioned it to him. So I felt like that was the whole reason for him driving so well in the first place, to try and get as big of a gap as possible. But like you say, the stewards have much more coverage to look at than we do. So it's kind of surprising that they didn't know about this. Because it's like you've got literally every camera on the track, and it's not like there's only 4 or 5 of them. They're literally plastered everywhere. So I don't know what was going on there.
If you watch a lot of the practice coverage, especially for F1, you'll always see the scrutineers that are assigned to each team from the stewarding panel. You can see them by the garage with their clipboards and stuff, making notes. I don't know if they are working for the F2 teams as well, but if they're not, then why aren't they? We should be seeing that. I wanted to talk briefly about the Vips thing, though, because in my opinion, the strakes were 1.5 mils over the reference plane, and I think that's a fair cop. Really, it's a high-tech mistake, but I just think that the car was out of doesn't meet the dimensions that prescribed by the FIA, so therefore the car was illegal. So therefore he was disqualified from qualifying. I think that's perfectly normal and don't actually have a problem with it, surprisingly.
No, I agree with this, and I think there's a leeway of 5 mil from what I read on the FIA's website as well.
0.5.
Well, I think, from my understanding, maybe that was the thing, they were 5 mil over and it's 3.5 leeway, and they had an extra 1.5 mil. But yes, they have a little bit of leeway and they went over it. So I've no issue with the stewarding on that. It was maybe again, when trying to score a fantasy league, I've got some extra elements of frustration. But
it's the potential of where they're going to be if they get reinstated or disqualified. Yeah.
In the days of Murray Walker and Hunt commentating, and you tune in 5 minutes before the race starts, all of this would just be taken care of. But in the age of Twitter and the age of social media and the age of openness to a certain extent, it was just all these unknowns. We didn't know how qualifying was, the order it was going to be, Vips getting disqualified, and then it's high-tech, not the stewards, in all fairness, high-tech looking to appeal and then withdrawing their appeal. And for fans who just tune in before the race starts, they probably were just like, oh, this happened overnight. But while you're like the fans that we can be, I was just so confused by it all. But maybe I should be encouraged that nobody has a clue what's going on. It's not just us. But let's move on from that. The rookies then. So Piastri, I think we've really, really spoken how highly we rate him and how well he did. Lawson seems to just be in control of that race. Thiemo, you watched F3 last year. Is this something we should be expecting more of for the rest of the season?
I was actually going to say, I think it's just a continuation of their title fight from F3 from last year, because you would think that they both come up, they both got good teams behind them, and they've not lost any of the momentum from the look of things. So you just kind of, if it wasn't for Zhou, you'd think, oh, okay, these two are just going to come in and just steamroll over everyone because they've got unfinished business with each other. This Lawson was like, well, my championship could have been mine, so I'm going to start off strong and win this race. Because like, oh, okay, we're going to do that, then are we? And everyone else is just like, oh, right. So it was a really strong performance from both of them, and for sure, despite some of his bad luck early on, he had a really strong feature race, if I'm remembering correctly, the order of the races. And then, so it's like really good performance from the rookies. I mean, there was a couple of bad luck for people like Pocher, because again, we know he's quick. It just wasn't his weekend. But I think, again, like we were saying earlier, that gap between races is going to benefit him, and hopefully, I'm going to commentate and curse him now, but Monaco doesn't end up too badly for him.
Yeah, Monaco is going to be a strange one with just, we know overtaking is just not Monaco, and the reverse grids could really confuse a lot of matters. But Monaco, as we've spoken, is months away, so we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Yeah, it's going to be. Well, we'll figure out the predictions beforehand. Gareth, you've watched Formula 2 a long time. Any of these rookies showing a lot more promise than we've seen in the past?
I think Piastri was, reminiscent of Russell when he came in 2018 and was amazing. But Russell actually took a little while to get up to speed. So the first weekend, that was Bahrain that year, and it was Lando Norris who was just dominant in the feature race, and he looked like he was going to be the one to beat, and yet that was his only win all year. Whereas Russell just sort of like his performances ramped up, and then he was amazing. But I think Piastri hit the ground running and was superb. But I do think, I have to say, I thought the Ticktum Piastri collision was Piastri's fault. I think he was too eager, and he should have backed out in turn two and given Ticktum the position. And just come home with a good haul of points in that race, rather than trying to battle it to the end and getting knocked out into retirement. Weird for me to blame someone other than Ticktum in an accident, but in this occasion,
let's talk about Ticktum, Gareth. And I know you mentioned before last season you were talking about the chewing up of the tyres, and you were unsure if it was Ticktum or the team. Ticktum impressed me this weekend. His first radio message we heard when he was told of his penalty, he was fairly understanding. It was a fair cop. It changed a little bit later on when he was getting spun around, and we're back to the normal Ticktumisms. But yeah, I thought Ticktum quite impressive, and we never really spoke about him last time we spoke about a championship campaign, I don't think. But I thought, yeah, Ticktum, strong contender for the championship potentially. What do you think, Gareth?
I thought he was very strong actually. Yeah, and he did prove that it was. I mean, you only had to go and look at where the Dams drivers finished as well to see that the Dams were struggling on their tyres towards the end of the races, whereas the Carlin that Ticktum is now driving can last on its tyres. So I think we had to assume that he was correct, that it was the Dams more than himself last year. Although obviously there is always going to be a bit of learning as well, and you know, a year of experience on this Pirelli rubber is always going to be better than just coming in from scratch. So yeah, I think he did very well. One driver I really want to give massive praise to though, Richard Verschoor in the MP. I thought he was amazing all weekend, and I really hope that he gets his funding sorted for the rest of the season, because he really delivered for me, and I thought he was fantastic. Yeah,
you touched on it briefly there, didn't you, Thiemo? That when we spoke last time, Verschoor wasn't announced as that second MP driver. It was still the joke of who are MP going to announce. But yeah, he seemed to be very comfortable. And I know last year, again, from my coming in late, that MP aren't generally the team you're looking at to be, fighting right at the front, and is a little bit potentially of Felipe Drugovich pulling them forwards, although Nobu got a win as well. I think it was in Spain. But yeah, Verschoor seemed to be the real deal, and I don't know if MP are going to be fighting for the team's championship, but yeah, Verschoor should be getting another drive, we'd hope, if it was based on talent alone.
I mean, his performance over the weekend, I mean, I don't know if it was partly in retaliation to the fact that he had quite a bad first race because of Ticktum, but and he just seemed more determined to try and make up for it after that or not. But they seemed much stronger than from what I remember them last year. Like they might not be fighting for the championship, but they're going to be a solid midfield team, I think, if they can continue as this. And he just kind of went out the gate running and just did a really good job there. So I think, all things considered, there he should be quite happy with himself. And the only reason he didn't get more points was because he got knocked out of the first race. So you can't really do much about that.
MP brought in new engineers last season, and Felipe Drugovich was saying they brought some up from F3. They've got some new recruits in, and it's definitely helped revitalise the team and given them a really strong engineering base to get on top of the car. And that is partly why they're driving their way forwards. But obviously, I'd still say Verschoor is definitely a talent, same as Drugovich. And Lirim Sendeli, he had some strong moments, but overall, I think he was more indicative of someone who was, it's going to take a little while to gel with the championship.
I think it's going to definitely be interesting to see how much of this from all of the drivers, especially the ones perhaps not doing as well as people were expecting to, how much of it is down to it being the first round of the season and just getting back up to stuff. Because as much as you can train and do karting and F3 and whatever, it's still a different thing altogether when you get to F2 again. So it'll be interesting to see how much the gap between races now does for that, and being now that they've got one under the belt, they're like, okay, I remember what to do to this now. So next time I do it, it's going to go a lot better.
Absolutely,
it's probably not going to be the case for a few of them.
And also, Bahrain is a very unique circuit as well. So you have that higher degradation because the track needs to be like that to keep the sand off. But you see Carlin seem to be Bahrain specialists, and you do. And like I was thinking back to Lando Norris again, 2018. So potentially the order could completely change when we get to Monaco. I don't think it is going to, because we were always expecting it to be between Prema, Virtuosi, then High Tech, Carlin, and a bit of ART. So yeah, I mean, just like 5 teams going for it, and then MP sitting behind them as well. So but we could see a bit of a change when we get to the next race, and things could change a little bit. So that would be interesting to see.
I do want to move on.
The last thing I want to That's just one very small thing, just to disagree with both of you on Ticktum slightly. So I think I'd have been more impressed with his performance if he'd been a rookie driver, because with all the years of experience he's had now, and then with the incidents he had in the first two races, I was there thinking that's stuff that you shouldn't be doing at the moment. Like I can't remember who it was with. He had a few of them, but whenever he said his marvelous quote when he got spun round, it's like, well, that was all on you as far as I'm aware, because you came from nowhere. There's this driver on a racing line doing his own thing, and you just come out of nowhere. He's not focusing on you because there's another car in between, so you shouldn't be too surprised that you're going to get spun around there. So moan all you want, but that's not going to, like, you kind of got to take the blame yourself there. So if he hadn't had the experience, I wouldn't have, I'd probably be agreeing a bit more with you, but because of that, I'm just not impressed.
That's fair enough, but I was just a slight segue on that one driver that I want to speak about, and we're talking about academies, and Ticktum's finally been confirmed that he's in the Williams Academy, because there's a lot of confusion about that over the off season. But Armstrong, for me, and we mentioned the 5 teams there, the 5-6 teams that are going to be towards the top. Has Armstrong just got no F2 chance and in particular no F1 chance after this weekend? He doesn't seem to me like he's going to be in a title fight.
It wasn't a great start for him, but at the same time, I feel like it could have been worse. So I'm not sure where to quite put him yet, because it's still early days, and I know it's a short calendar, but you only need one good round to be really back into it then, and maybe you just got the bad one out of the way early. It's hard to know, but I think he could have definitely done with being better, but I wouldn't count him out just yet, because again, it could have still been a lot worse. It could have been Phipps, it could have been a lot worse.
Yeah. Back in the day, Ferrari used to have Raffaele Marcello on their books, and he was racing in GP2 of the day. Everyone was always saying, watch out for Marcello, he's going to be amazing. Did diddly squat and didn't progress, and it was absolutely baffling, because he was driving for good teams. Fast forward to today, maybe Marcus Armstrong is the new Raffaele Marcello, and despite having that Ferrari Driver Academy role, he's maybe not quite got that extra 5% to step up. So we're waiting to see.
We're all cursing drivers today, aren't we?
Yeah, don't write him off after one meeting, but I do agree with you that he didn't seem as strong as I was anticipating.
Well, let's move on to Formula One then. The Formula One returned as well as Formula 2 and only had a third of the amount of races, but what a race it was, guys. I think there's a proper championship fight. So we had on Saturday, finally, could tell if the sandbags were on the Mercedes, and they weren't. Mercedes were better from how I viewed it than they were in pre-season testing, but Red Bull and Honda, and big shout out to Honda from where they were, was it 2015 with McLaren? They're the best engine on the grid now, or best power unit. I have to be, very, very turbo hybrid specific. They're so good. This is going to be great. We've got Verstappen and we've got Hamilton in a proper title fight. Perez potentially. Bottas was Bottas, sadly. And McLaren, Ferrari, not far behind. Alpine, Aston Martin, I don't know what went wrong there. Those guys don't seem to be the fastest. And AlphaTauri, although Gasly lost his front wing and Tsunoda ended up being a bit further back than he should have been. This season's going to be absolutely on fire, Gareth. I was so impressed.
Yeah, it's going to be a barnstormer. We've always wanted that title fight between two teams and two drivers from two teams, which looks like we're getting this year. And as everyone kept saying, Verstappen versus Hamilton, it's the ticket that everyone has wanted to see. I don't think Vettel versus Hamilton really ignited people like this one's going to.
Well, I think with this, you've got Red Bull have the better car, but Mercedes have the better driver in terms of balancing it out, because you could argue that's why Hamilton won the weekend. The car wasn't there for him, but if it wasn't him, if it was Verstappen v Bottas, I think Verstappen would have got it. So I think it's that interesting dynamic there. If Max has the car underneath him and the skills to do it, but Lewis is just vastly more experienced, and he's not a 7-time world champion for nothing at the end of the day. So I think that just it helps balance things out and keep things interesting. And we've not really had that the last couple of years. So
You must have a death wish saying that Verstappen's not as good as Lewis. I
Could be wrong after last weekend.
I think he is. He is the up and coming superstar, and I think the problem for Verstappen is he's had so many races where his car wasn't as good as the Mercedes, and he was just driving around trying to keep on the back of them. This weekend, I think that Mercedes outfoxed Red Bull with the strategy. It was down to the strategy, and then Lewis's masterful driving to make Verstappen run off track at T4 to make the pass, and then had to give it back, and that was like the end of the tyre advantage that he had, that 10-lap differential. So it was a storming drive. Lewis probably still is the greatest driver on the grid and possibly the greatest of all time. And that really did show it, like you say, Thiemo. But I wouldn't say Verstappen is that far away from him in terms of skill.
It's difficult.
Not a big difference, but just enough to keep it interesting for now in terms of the analogy for better car and better driver. So
we'll go with that.
It's difficult to say, really, isn't it? Because we haven't had a title fight between the two of them. We haven't had many on-track fights between the two of them in a fair situation. And there's one argument that the track fighting, the turn 4 incident at Bahrain wasn't fair either. Max was on better tyres, Lewis quickly fading. But this year could be the one we finally have this argument put to bed. We saw Schumacher and Hamilton cross over a little bit, but they were in vastly different teams, so it was difficult to gauge the two of them. But if we've got an actual, and you're right, Gareth, Vettel and Hamilton, it never really happened. That was Ferrari shooting themselves in the foot more than it was Vettel, although Vettel had his Germany incident. But this could be it. If Mercedes will make the steps forwards, as we think they will, but Red Bull can hold a little bit of an advantage too. These are two, generational drivers, as in once in a generation type drivers, and it could be their respective generations. So we're going to see them up against each other. Lewis in the tail end of his season, Max in, I'd say, the early days. I think this is like his 6th or 7th season. It's ridiculous.
7th season, that's crazy.
Absolutely bonkers, and he's still one of the younger drivers on the grid. It just beggars belief. But this is going to be ace. I think a lot has been made rightly about the track limits, and we've spoken about it, but that wasn't why the race was lost, in my opinion. And nobody seems to be talking about the fact that Red Bull pulled Max in 4 or 5 laps after Hamilton went for the undercut on that first stint. And to me, that's bonkers. That is just, track position is king. And we can talk about the fact that they were going for this longer strategy in a lesser spotted 3-stop race, which we don't really see many of those these days. But I couldn't understand at the time why Red Bull didn't respond immediately, and maybe they were going to lose track position anyway, but they did have Max and Lewis on the same bit of tarmac on pit exit, presumably, and we know Red Bull is so quick at their pit stops. But then he came out way out of DRS, in second place, and the pass had to be made on the track, and we saw what happened there. Thiemo, Red Bull surely were the ones that lost the race more than it was Hamilton winning the race.
You've got to assume that Red Bull had a plan that they thought was going to work for them to try that. Otherwise, you think they must have, because of the alternative is they just dropped the ball in a very uncharacteristic kind of way. But as you say, it was curious to drop him out so far behind that he had to make up so much time to get near to him at the end. And even then after he had to give the place back to Hamilton, he then just couldn't catch him because of the tyres, I think. So I'm not sure what really happened there. Again, you trust the Red Bull team to know what they're doing. And then for this one, it just didn't seem all there. And it's just I don't have the answers.
Red Bull, I agree with you, Jim. Actually, I think Red Bull should you always got to react to the undercut when you're the leader like that, because I don't think they didn't have the pace advantage in the car to make that longer stint work. And I mean, ironically, if you go back and look at the pit stop times, they were probably gaining over a second per pit stop on Mercedes, because
especially with Bottas.
Yeah, well. But I mean, even Lewis's stops were like 2.7 and 3 seconds or something like that. compared to Red Bull doing pretty damn close to 2 second stops. So Mercedes lost time in the pit stops themselves, but it's those crucial laps, like you say, where Lewis was on the fresh rubber and making hay while the sun shone, or in the dark, and Verstappen was just not able to capitalise on his worn starting tyres. So it was a mistake.
It's going to be interesting to see it going forward, though, especially with Perez backing him up now, because I think if you look at Perez's performance, if he can get to P5 from the pit lane, imagine if he starts in a proper place on the grid. He's going to be right up there surely if he can drive like that again.
Well,
so
we know he can make it to first place from more or less the pit lane. Last year,
it was last at Sakir when he won.
One safety car could have really had Perez in the fight for a win, if not a podium, and I was really surprised that there wasn't later safety cars, but the drivers were fairly spread out. But that Vettel and Ocon wasn't it? That Vettel-Ocon incident, lucky there wasn't any debris, because that could have really have changed the race entirely if there was a safety car brought out then. But there was an early safety car, and the internet exploded when a certain Russian span into the barriers. Holds the record now for the shortest debut race with a mistake of your own fault, which I don't know if I believe in karma, guys, but
is that not the record you want? It's another one you should be going for.
Well, because the shortest debut is 6 feet.
There's an engine problem, right? Yeah. But
so you can't really do much about that, though. This is entirely in the fault of the driver.
It was hugely embarrassing, wasn't it? Just hugely embarrassing. And we saw Schumacher, he span as well, but kept it out of the barriers. So Haas...
It's quite the record to have more formation laps than GP racing laps, isn't it?
Yeah, it was. I was thinking about the results, and in terms of just general popularity of the drivers, take or leave it on the Hamilton and Verstappen front, but even people who don't like Hamilton, people who don't like Verstappen, got to admit that they are the top drivers at the moment. The order seemed to be pretty much about there. Popular ones like Norris and Sainz and Ricciardo scoring points as well, Leclerc. And then at the back, it was, as expected, Haas are going to be nowhere this year. It's going to be a miserable old year for them. Williams still backmarkers, but not.
Russell impressed me qualifying, though, because last year they made it into Q2 a few times and were quite impressed with that. And then straight away off the bat, Russell just straight into Q2. So it'd be nice if they can continue that from now on a bit. Because even if they don't get much further than that, it's good to see that progress at least. So
yeah, Russell is clearly a great qualifier. I don't know. I'd need to rewatch it, but I had the yellow flag incident, of course, in Q1. And I don't know if Russell was going to make it into Q2 if it wasn't for that, with some abandoned laps. And we don't know where Vettel could have turned up. But yeah, I think Williams are going to be stronger than they were, but that might just be by virtue of Haas being weaker than they were. But the midfield in between, though, guys, wow.
Alfa Romeo really stepped it up a notch from what I was expecting them.
Alfa versus Alfa.
Oh, yeah. Commentator's nightmare there. Which one are you on about?
But yeah,
they did a really great job there. So it's just, Yuki Tsunoda did exactly what you'd expect him to do, and just was quiet and got on with it. And just, I lost track of the amount of times he overtook world champions in that race, because just Alonso, Vettel, and Kimi just like, yeah, I'll do it again. I don't mind, and just did a really nice job. And then especially pipping Stroll at the end, and just like, you know what, I'll get another point while I'm here. Might as well. And they had a nice little scrap, but in the end, it's again the rookie driver that just, if we're going to go on experience, beats the experienced one again in the first race. So perfect start for him.
Yeah, AlphaTauri are looking strong, but Gareth, it wasn't the perfect start in terms of Gasly, but AlphaTauri, yeah, I think they are with McLaren and Ferrari at the front of the midfield.
Yeah, they've made a big step forward again, which is it's very positive to see, because I'm an old school Minardi fan, actually. So I've got one of their pit crew shirts. So maybe I'll have that as my my next prop. But yeah, I'm really happy to see their development. I don't know if well worth checking out on YouTube if you can find it. Ted Kravitz, when he went to visit Franz Tost at the AlphaTauri factory last year after the win. And Franz Tost is just such an enthusiastic, happy man, taking him around the factory and stuff. And it's absolutely brilliant. It's such a fascinating feature because you've got these two guys who are obviously F1 nerds, like talking to each other. And Franz he's got like a bit of carbon fiber off the car. He says, "Look at that, that's amazing." And it's just it's so good to see. So sorry, that's a long way of saying that I'm absolutely delighted to see where AlphaTauri are this year, and I'm fully expecting to see more podiums from them. Yuki Tsunoda just proved why we at Grand Prix Grandstand have been Yuki maniacs for quite a while now, and we've been promoting him on the site and saying, this is why we think he deserves to be in F1, and he delivered. In fact, he probably underperformed compared to where we were anticipating he would have been. And yeah, gutted for Gasly, but he's going to bounce back, so no worries there.
So it wasn't through fault of his own for Gasly, so he's got nothing really to beat himself up for there. So
precisely, yeah, absolutely.
Plus it's got to be an amusing fact as well that Yuki was overtaking drivers that when they made their debut, he was 9 months old. So it's got to be satisfying on some level.
It just blows my mind, and I think it just kind of shows that racing drivers can have a longer career these days, but also they perhaps these drivers need to move on a little bit now, but we'll wait and see.
Yeah, I'm torn on this one, and one for another day is Vettel past it, and
this weekend seemed to show it.
Well,
it was a rookie mistake.
It was an awful error, but he was fairly quick with his overtaking and then was just left on the tyres just for so long. But we'll talk about that another week. But more strikingly for me was Alonso was there or thereabouts, but Aston Martin and Alpine they're not there right now, are they? They are.
So Vettel, you could understand why he was so far at the back considering the penalties and everything, but Ocon didn't really have that same excuse. And he did all right last year with things that he didn't do as well as he perhaps should have in 2020, but he had a solid enough season. And then coming off the podium as well. And then he was just kind of, I'm also here, but it's just it's lacking something.
It's because they've got a low rake car, and the new regs suit the high rake. So that's why all those cars that follow the Red Bull design philosophy are doing well. Mercedes, though, they are good enough to get on top of that problem and deal with it running a low rake car. But Aston Martin have a smaller engineering base, and they're going to find it a lot harder. So, especially considering Mercedes created that philosophy, didn't they? Racing Point famously copied somehow the 2019 car to race last year. They've carried that over for this year, but they're with Ted Kravitz's famous cheese wedges that have been taken off the floor. I think Aston Martin are struggling to get on top of how to deal with that aero inefficiency that is now showing up on their car. They will get on top of it eventually, hopefully with some help from Mercedes, I expect. But
so I think the comment that didn't age well from the very start was Otmar saying, "Yeah, we can get them both in the top 10, no problem." And then you're struggling to get one of them in there because he's coming along and just like, no.
But Vettel disappointed me for his instantly blaming Ocon. He said he moved in the braking zone. He clearly didn't. Ocon was going in a straight line. I'm glad Vettel, owned up to it after the race and said, "No, that was my mistake." But
still shouldn't be happening.
No, Vettel's always one of these drivers that I absolutely love out of the car, but in the car he is, he does make these mistakes. He's quite
It's not the first start he would have wanted, I don't think, was it?
No, it's a bit disappointing, and it does raise questions about, how long can he last?
Yeah, it's
especially with Ferrari doing as well. Sorry, go on.
I say it's rookie errors from a driver that should know so much better and drive so much better than he has. Those spins over the last few years are, disappointing. Now, just to wrap things up, guys, we are going to try a new feature or a regular feature on the race weekends. And anybody listening, anybody watching, let us know what title we should go with this. We've had some conversations before. And Gareth, your suggestions was amazing or
There's amazed or palm-faced.
Amazed or palm-faced. And I'm a lover of alliteration and I'm a lover of rhyming. So winners and spinners or something tied with cars. But in short, we're going to go for everybody's across Formula 2 and Formula 1 this weekend, but it'll be Formula 3, W Series and Formula 1 if they are doing that sort of weekend. Top 3 drivers, bottom 3 drivers, or do we think we should go for the top driver each and then just everybody have one driver, guys? But
yeah, one driver and one loser. Yeah.
And so we'll end up with 3. Okay. So Gareth, top driver of the weekend across both categories and bottom driver of the weekend?
Top driver, I'm going to say Zhou, Guanyu Zhou. I think for the consistency he delivered across it. Obviously, there's no point giving it to Lewis or Verstappen. It's expected of them. Tsunoda didn't quite deliver enough to get that title. So Zhou, yeah. Bottom driver.
Oh, sorry, let's go to the bottom drivers afterwards, so we can.
Okay, sorry, mate.
We can dump on them collectively. Thiemo, top driver.
I think just for the sake of variety, Zhou is absolutely right on being the top choice there. But I think for me, Piastri, just because I wasn't necessarily expecting him to come out of the blocks quite so well, and some of his overtakes were just phenomenal. F1, it's like I said, Lewis and Max, you kind of expect it. So I think Perez for me, just because that recovery was just sublime. So.
Well, I'm going to have to cut you off and make you or force you to choose just one of those 2, and we'll stick with the winner.
We'll go with an F1 driver and say Perez then. Have their space. Well,
you can feel better, Thiemo, because my driver from both series would be Piastri. Very, very impressive. Alpine Academy, they're the winners, really, weren't they? The three of their drivers in Formula 2 racing against each other.
They're going to need them at this rate.
Yes, indeed. And on that, bottom driver, Gareth.
Well, I think it's kind of obvious, isn't it? It's Mazepin. Mazzy Spin.
Mazzy Spin, indeed. Thiemo, is this going to be a 3 for 3 on Mazzy Spin?
Oh yeah, I mean, I'll be keeping an eye on that tracker, that new website to keep track of all his spins now. So I think there's plenty more where that came from, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. So good way to start there. Consistency is key.
Yeah, I agree. Mazepin was just woeful, not just in the race, but he was spinning all weekend. And we saw Latifi do it last year, but yeah.
I don't know if you two saw the tweet that Jack Aitken put out halfway through the race.
Go on.
This again, no names or anything, but you know exactly what he's talking about. It's suddenly I feel a lot less worse about me spinning on lap 60 last year.
Great, Jack Aitken. Very good indeed. Now, guys, we're out of time and we'll have to do this all over again. So, Gareth, where can people find you on the internet this week?
They can find me at gpgrandstand.com or come and look me up on Facebook. I'm the only Gareth Winslade on there.
Well, the only Gareth Winslade. How about you, Thiemo?
You can find me over on DriveTribe and pretty much all the time as well on Instagram at t.albers.daily.drivetribe.
Indeed. You can find my writing on gpgrandstand.com and I write at fortloc.com as well. You can find my F1 satire video series, which I will be recording pretty soon, the F1 Week That Was. Just search the F1 Week That Was on YouTube. And of course, you can find me on gpgrandstand.com where I write and gpgrandstand TV. Make sure you drop us a like and subscribe if you enjoy what we're doing. Thank you for listening to us talk about F1 for just about an hour. Keep your ears peeled for us speaking F1 once again next time.